Simon Johnson is an economist at MIT Sloan, former chief economist for the IMF, and in a new book, White House Burning, he takes on the national debt. So Simon, I get scared about a lot of things, and I always seem to go back to worrying about the debt problem. Just how worried should I be?
You should definitely be concerned. It's not a fiscal crisis like Greece or other parts of Europe. We've had worse fiscal crises even in the history of the United States, but there's no question we shouldn't be complacent. We shouldn't keep postponing what we need to do in order to get the debt under control.
Since this really came to the fore a few years ago, especially with the Tea Party, a lot of the budget experts were saying, we have time, we can put a long-term plan in place. But then the years go by, so how much time do we have?
Well, we do have some time. We do have some decades to make a sensible adjustment, but I would start now. The Bush-era tax cuts are due to expire at the end of this year. Our proposal, in the book, we make this clear and explain why. Don't extend those tax cuts. None of them.
Completely.
Absolutely. That would be a significant down payment on the fiscal adjustment we need to make. Now, this is not going to win me any popularity contest. I understand this. I'm not running for office on the basis of this book. But if you look at the numbers and look at the sustainability of our debt, look at what we've done to our revenue, we need to have more revenue to sustain what the government does if you want to keep in place Social Security and Medicare, which, again, we go through it in the book. We think those are, broadly speaking, sensible programs and worth supporting.
You know what's so interesting? I've heard that issue come up from people on the left and then also some conservatives who have embraced this idea. So that would come up with, what, $4 trillion in revenue? Would we have to do a lot more, or can that solve the majority of the problem?
Well, it depends what your goal is. Our recommendation is aim for debt to GDP at about 50% ratio by 2030. So there's a bit more you have to do, and there are some small changes you could make on the Social Security side, Medicare side, also raising some taxes, putting capital gains tax back closer to the tax on ordinary income, for example. But those changes would have to be relatively small if you don't extend the Bush-era tax cuts. If you extend those Bush tax cuts or you make them permanent, then you have to make a really big fiscal adjustment, actually a bigger adjustment than anything we've ever done in the past in American history. That's a much more daunting prospect.
That seems like a really just wonderful solution because it's just so simple. There's familiarity there in the tax code. But you also hear a lot of people saying that we would benefit so much more with tax reform, simplifying the code. How do you square those two ideas?
Well, I'm in favor of tax reform done properly and not rushed. Corporate tax system could definitely be overhauled. Personal tax to some extent. I am worried that a lot of the proposals out there are really more or less disguised tax-cutting schemes. Now is not a good time to cut taxes. If you want to keep Social Security, you want to keep Medicare, you want to have basic social insurance, which is what we have for relatively older people in an aging society, you have to fund that. Funding those programs by selling debt to ourselves or to the Chinese is not a good idea. We need to move away from that. That's why we emphasize the need to have a robust revenue system in this country, and we've lost track of that in the past 3 decades.
How much should you cut taxes? What's the optimal level of tax cuts?
Well, it depends on what you want the government to do. You have to start with the purpose of government, the function of government. And mostly what the U.S. government does today in terms of the composition of spending is it runs Social Security and Medicare, the social insurance programs. So you look at that and you figure out what are the requirements of those programs, given that the society is aging, and from that back out what you need in terms of revenue to get the debt onto a more sustainable path. So I would start with a debate about what you want government to do. Interesting fact, 40% of people who use Social Security don't think they participate in the government program. It's the same for Medicare. People don't understand what the federal government does. We need to clear that up before we figure out how to make this sustainable.
Now, when I look at the Reagan record, though, and you're going to hear it a lot, I think, in the next couple of months, that huge rebound in growth, the huge drop in the unemployment rate, even much more substantial than what we're seeing now in this recovery. How much of that was kind of the tax cuts, and was it justified for what the challenge was at the time?
Not much of the rebound was about the tax cuts, honestly. And remember that Reagan also raised taxes. The 1986 tax reform and a number of the other changes around that time increased taxes because people became very concerned about the deficit and about the debt. Alan Greenspan warned about it. Volcker warned about it. Bob Dole was a old-style fiscal conservative who really didn't want to just cut taxes. In fact, he got a lot of grief from Newt Gingrich for exactly that. We need more Bob Dole-type leadership, particularly within the Republican Party, as well as sensible leadership focused on fiscal responsibility on the Democratic side.